All right, welcome back to the last session of the day. How many of you are feeling inspired? Raise your hand. Nice. How many of you are feeling a little exhausted? Same hands. Yeah. So last session of the day, I'll say a few words at the end, but take it easy on yourself tonight. We have a full day tomorrow, and we're doing a lot. Maybe you're just sitting and talking to people, but there's a lot of deep work, and we're about to go even deeper. One of the most popular sessions at last year's responsive conference was taught by a professor at NYU on the topic of love, Meg Poe. And we had people walking out in tears. It's not often at a business conference you talk about things like love. Today, Marcus and I, who I'll introduce shortly, put our heads together and said, actually, there's a topic that's really fresh for all of us right now, which is forgiveness. So whether it's parents' punishment of children, punitive punishment in the workplace, or harsh sentences for nonviolent crimes, the world today has an overly punitive approach to justice. Rather than finding more opportunities for empathy and for forgiveness, we're punishing. So with an aim to heal ties between neighbors, we're closing day one of Responsive Conference 2018 with a conversation about forgiveness. And moderating this conversation is my friend Marcus Glover. Marcus has an extensive background that maybe he'll go into a little bit, but he was first introduced to me as somebody teaching meditation on stage. It turned out later he's also a venture capitalist and a bunch of other things. But I think some of the most meaningful work that he's described to me that he does is teaching meditation and development work with inmates, sitting down with folks in prison and helping them develop themselves towards more of who they want to be. And I'll leave it to Marcus to introduce the rest of the folks that we have up here. I'm really, really excited for this last session. So thanks for being here, and let's give a standing ovation to these four even before we meet them.
Hello.
And here's Marcus.
Can you hear me?
Chick.
Oh, stay up. Don't sit down. That was perfectly appropriate. So I'm going to do quick intros, and guess what? We're going to stay on our feet because we're going to meditate. So joining me, I'm Marcus Glover. I'm super happy to be here at Responsive with my friend Robin and so many of my friends here in the audience. I have the distinct pleasure of having with me three people that honestly, when Robin said, I want you to have a talk on stage, I thought, who would I love to have living room conversations with? And these are the folks that you would love to have at dinner table. So to my far right, I have Mr. Mark Brand. Mark is a serial entrepreneur, social impact entrepreneur who has an incredible destination in Vancouver called Save on Meats, which provides a complete holistic approach to community, providing a restaurant that provides services for homeless people, marginalized people. He'll go a lot more into that work. In the middle, I have Oneika Mays, and just a complete magical person. She is helping to lead wellness programs at Rikers Island Prison, which as you sit here today, Rikers is probably no more than a quarter mile away. And then to my closest, this is, I like to call her my niece. She has been a member of my family for about 20 years. How many people saw the movie Hotel Rwanda? And if you didn't see the movie, just raise your hand, okay? Because you should see it. Hotel Rwanda is a brilliant Oscar-nominated movie on the Rwandan genocide. And there's a really famous actor named Don Cheadle. And Don Cheadle portrayed Carine's father, who is the real life hero of Hotel Rwanda. So we'll dig in a little bit more with each person on a different aspect of forgiveness. But before we do, I want to turn it to Oneika so we can have a moment just to cleanse the palate, have a little meditation. So Oneika.
Thank you. Hi. Thank you. You know, forgiveness is a tricky subject, right? I see already people nodding. So many things happen to us that can break us, and we feel a lot of shame and a lot of blame. And we've been talking about this conversation, and it may get heavy, it may get deep, but in the end, it's all so we can get closer to ourselves. When we get close to ourselves, we can see people. And I want to let you know right now that I see you. I see all of you. And know that when we talk today, if things feel tight or uncomfortable, it's nothing to run away from. And then if you do run away from it, that's okay too. Our conversation today is about being okay with what doesn't feel okay and opening up to that moment. So it feels good to just shake. Just shake it out. You had a long day, so this will energize you a bit. You can let your hands come down and then shift a little from side to side. There may even be a little hip action that gets in there. And take a deep breath in, and you can sigh it out. Yeah, noise is good, right? To move that stuff up and out. Let's do that again. Deep breath in, and then let it go. Yeah. And then if you'd like, you can keep your eyes open or closed, but I like to place a hand on my heart space because this idea starts here, right? This idea of compassion, of love, of forgiveness starts with the self. And sometimes this can be the hardest place to find it. So know that at any time you can always come back to this. And with your hand on your heart, you can begin to notice your feet. You may even wiggle your toes, noticing the tops of your shoulders, and then bringing some attention to that heart space. And maybe for a moment, calling someone who you love to mind. It can be a person, maybe a pet, someone who has unconditional love and support for you, and bringing that person to mind, wishing them well, wishing them compassion, health, safety, and joy, and feeling that underneath your hand, going through your hand to your heart. You can take a deep breath in and a deep breath out. And with that love that you feel for that person or pet, know that forgiveness can start with you, and the love that you feel for a person, you can also feel for yourself. And so the next time your hand comes to your heart, maybe thinking about that, you can release your hand down. You can let your eyes open. And let's chat.
Thank you. So I have to tell you, I'm a lucky man. I get to see Oneika once a week on average over the last couple of years, and there's not the words to express how inspirational her work is, going into many of the jails and prisons here in and around New York City to help people behind bars find those moments of forgiveness. So I just want to jump right in. You are what I would consider on the front lines of helping traumatized people to end the war against themselves. Can you talk a little bit and share some of your thoughts?
Yeah, I like that. And the war. There is a war that's happening, and I think it does begin with ourselves. When I've been thinking about this idea of what forgiveness is, and so many of the people that I work with, and I like to think of people who are in jail as community members who are incarcerated. There tends to be this thought process that people who are in jail are over there, and we forget about them. But when we forget about other people, we end up forgetting about ourselves. So when I go inside, it's really important. Like I saw you, I make sure that I see everybody. People who are incarcerated, there's so much shame and blame that happens, right? And I find that we come far away from ourselves. We have this idea that we are whole, right, when we're little, and then things happen. They chip away and they chip away. And then hurt people, we were talking about this earlier, hurt people. So if you are loved, love people. And part of the work that I do through meditation and yoga is to give people an opportunity to fill up those spaces those holes that were made through shame and blame. I think of one particular student who I teach in the transgender dorm in a jail here in Manhattan. And she she used to come to class and she didn't say much. She would just show up and she would, she'd take class and she'd meditate and then she'd leave. And slowly you could see this process of me seeing her seeing herself. She started to open up to this idea of forgiving herself. And it was incredible because one day she sat down and she said, I'm okay. Yeah, right? And I was like, you are okay. And she said, it's hard for me to forgive myself for the things that I've done. And I'm mad at other people who I have helped in the past. And then when I got arrested, they didn't want to help me and I was angry at them. She hadn't talked to her family about transitioning. And it had been about 12 years since she had talked to members of her family. So she actually decided while she was inside, with help of some of the women who were also in the house with her, because that happens too, right? Trauma and pain sort of bonds us together, and they encouraged her to call her family. And she said, Oneika, they didn't give a hoot, which I love the word hoot, by the way, but she said they didn't give a hoot about the fact that I had transitioned. And she realized that through this moment of letting herself be seen and really seeing herself, she could sort of start to let go of some of those external messages that we get, right, that create this separation from her and the rest of the world. And it's been nothing short of transformational. And her story is like so many other stories that I see, where she starts to accept herself, because we are more than the worst thing that we've ever done. And we're more than the best thing that we will ever do. And when we were talking about this whole idea of connecting and forgiving ourselves, it's being able to own it all, the things that make us feel uncomfortable, the things that make our stomach tight, and also the things that make us feel good. So it's people like her that I'm called to come back every week. Because if we have folks who are behind bars, we're all behind bars. And it sounds trite, but it's so true. That it's, I was at a conference a few years ago where someone said, who was formerly incarcerated, he said the number one things that people can do is to come visit. Mm-hmm. And Rikers Island is literally an island. And it's a bridge, and it's separated, and people are forgotten. And so I think it's really important in this work that we don't forget, and that you even knowing now, you're seeing them, because now you know that this happens.
So picking up on that, and thank you for that, mm-hmm. Picking up on that thought of what I'll call othering, them over there, that island, those people behind bars. Mm-hmm. Part of this whole idea of forgiveness is, how are we able to not other, so that we all have a greater sense of empathy for one another? And over the years, Carine, spent a lot of time with you and your family. I will never get that picture out of my head of seeing in the movie the family portrayed by Don Cheadle leaving Rwanda, because that was you. That was you as a little girl. In Rwanda, you had Tutsis, and what is it that was able to, because after the genocide, people don't remember that was my neighbor who lived right there, and he's still my neighbor right there, but we were just in a civil war. So how do you put community back together? How do you create some empathy and understanding after, one of the greatest horrors the world has ever witnessed?
So the post-genocide Rwanda was very difficult for many people, not only because a lot of people had lost their entire families, their homes, and everything that had ever owned, but also they were still scarred from the violence and the atrocities that they had just witnessed. And most importantly, there was no more trust, and the whole idea of community and neighbors wasn't really part of Rwandan life anymore, just because knowing that my next door neighbor may have killed half of my family members just made the situation among neighbors very tense. And so in trying to reconstruct Rwanda, the Rwandans came up with a revived and old form of justice system. It's a type of transitional justice system, which is called gacaca. And it basically means that every community in Rwanda, little villages, they would come together with the wise men of the village, or a person who wasn't necessarily implicated in the genocide or was known to be innocent. He would sit in the middle, and then all the people would come together. And first, most importantly, people have to be willing to make those steps to come for the conversation and to right the wrongs, and for the victims to stand up and say, this person did this to me, and now I'd like to. And then that person has an opportunity to speak, to ask for forgiveness, or to at least converse with the person and come to begin to rebuild and reconstruct. And I think part of what forgiveness means to me, and what I've learned to understand is, I hope to continue to understand, is that when seeing a woman who literally lost everything in her children, her husband, her family, and still able to stand up and forgive the person and the two people responsible for that, and if that woman who literally lost everything is capable to forgive and to move forward and to begin to reconstruct her life, then I think it's possible for most people. And so that's
Wow.
wow.
I feel like I just need to sit with that for a moment. That just really resonates. And Mark, what does it mean, and what are some of the learnings of helping people who frequently, in New York City, for example, there is a homeless population that is the visible invisible, right? You see our people everywhere who are homeless, and yet they're completely invisible. No voice, no power. How from the communities that you have worked, how have you been able to create more visibility for marginalized people and people living on the edges?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump into that. And I just wanted to say something we said outside before we joined you guys that is sort of resonant for me right now, is that forgiveness isn't, when I decide to forgive you, it's not for you, it's for me. Mm-hmm. It's not for you, that's your power that you still have until I decide that that's no longer your power. So what's so important in forgiveness and in reconciliation in that place isn't that I'm letting you off the hook. It's that I'm letting myself come out from underneath any power that you hold of me forever. That doesn't mean I'm going to be cool with you. It just means that I'm good with me and I love me. So I just wanted to put a pin in that one. The neighborhoods that I work in, we talk about homelessness, and I'm hoping to transition that into a conversation of unhoused, and I hope to transition that even further into a socioeconomic discussion. That is, then there is no us and them, there's only us. Mm-hmm. So I was unhoused the first time when I was 14, multiple times through my life due to addiction. And when I was in that situation, there's an automatic moniker that you are less than. And it's just completely and utterly untrue, right? So the most beautiful people I've had the opportunity to work with don't have a lot of the same trappings of things and are facing adversity, but are the first people to step up and help others. So there's these other archetypes that we've created of the old man with the beard, with the stained mustache, and the dog in the can, and he's having an outburst of some sort. And there's the veteran, and there's all of these other archetypes. And while some of them may ring true, they're a very, very small amount of what we're actually facing as North America is homelessness, which is 7 out of 10 North Americans are one paycheck away from destitute. That's a real number, and I think that we downplay it. Actually, I think it's probably more like 8.2 or something. And so if we're facing this crisis consistently, then what are we doing about the larger problem? Direct homelessness and dealing with marginalized folks. We work with employment strategies, outreach strategies. Generally, they are people who are coming out of prison, who are out of options, who are coming back from war, and who've been, without getting too heavy, been prescribed an addiction through opioids that they can no longer afford when they hit the ground. So a $50 pill or a $5 heroin hit becomes not a choice that you make, you just make it. And so there's all of these other constraints that we're not really dealing with that are creating this stem into. There was a piece in the LA Times yesterday that was like a glimmer of hope for me, which was new data from an organization ground level is suggesting there's more than 100,000 people homeless. I think that number is more than 250,000 in Los Angeles. I think the numbers are astronomical. And if we're talking about the work that we do directly, which is advocating, but also getting people into purposeful employment to then serve food to the other people that need it. We've created our own culture and sort of ecosystem around that everybody can play in, which is the most important part. Then we can start to look at these systemic issues. What happens when, let's say the conversation we're having this morning, all previous weed charges get dropped and 230,000 people hit the street? Well, how do we deal with that as cities and as municipalities? So I think, and excuse me if I went too far out there, but I think there's just so many things that we can approach that we know that we're great at. We're great at systems. It's 2018. We live in them. We all understand them. Empathy is something we all practice in this room for sure, and I think our wider circles probably do. How do we create inclusive ways for people to be involved in the solution? And it starts with forgiveness of self, because privilege ultimately makes you feel like you aren't able to be part of a solution.
So let's go now, wade a bit deeper into those waters. So we tend to be a little comfortable in the conversation of forgiveness because in one way or another, we all want to be forgiven. But what I see is there is this great wall, this barrier to forgiveness, which is my privilege. I can't forgive this person on the street. I can't forgive these so-called convicts behind bars because, well, they did something, right? When we don't even realize that the largest institution for mental illness are prisons, right? So we're punishing people rather than helping to heal people in prisons. So let's talk about privilege. What is this drug, if you will, of privilege that keeps us from having greater empathy towards, our communities? Anybody want to take that?
Yeah, I think you said something really interesting, right? When we talk about, it's hard to forgive the person over there, or it's hard to forgive the person who did something bad. So much of this idea of how we identify as a person in society is centered around good and bad, shame and blame, pleasure and pain. We have these ways that we operate. So if I can put the finger over there and say, well, that person did something bad, what we're actually saying is I did something bad and I don't want anybody else to see it, right? I don't want to deal with that. Or I'm embarrassed because I did something and I didn't get caught, or I did get caught, and there are ways that I just don't want to deal with the fact that makes me uncomfortable. And when we talk about privilege, that's what we're talking about. This makes me uncomfortable because then I have to admit that there is some way that I'm benefiting from something. And if I admit that, then if I'm a good person, I have to do something about it. And I don't know if I'm a good person, right? That's the rub right there. That's the thing. Am I a good person? Am I not a good person if I don't want to do anything about it? So we have all of these uncomfortable feelings, and this is where forgiveness becomes really important, to admit that these things exist and that privilege happens on different levels. And to give a working definition of the word privilege, it's an unearned benefit, right? So privilege for this conversation is you benefit somehow and you have nothing to do with it, right? I have the privilege of having two amazing parents. And I was born to two amazing parents who were college graduates and who worked really hard, and there was no discussion about how I was going to be raised. I had nothing to do with that. I give them plenty of reason to question it, but that was a privilege that I have. And growing up and being a woman of color who's queer, there were times I did not want to admit that I had privilege. That, well, I'm bisexual and I'm black. I get oppressed. Like, what do you mean I have privilege? But I have parents who took really good care of me and made sure that I was okay, and that's privilege. I had nothing to do with that. That was all them. And so to acknowledge that meant that I had to give something up. And to give something up, I had to acknowledge the fact that I felt bad about that. And then in order to let that go, I had to forgive myself, right? And the minute that I did that, I felt a wall just completely crumble. And it's a wall that once it's down, you can't unknow. You can't unknow once you're awake to something. And we were talking earlier about this calling, and the minute that I walked into Rikers Island the first time, I'm like, oh, I'm supposed to be here, right? Like, these are my people. You find your people. And it's hard to say, like, I benefit from something, Because if I benefit from something, that means what? Somebody else is getting squashed. And that's too ugly to think about. That makes us uncomfortable. Because I live a certain way and I get things because of certain things, that means somebody else is not getting them. And then that means I have to do something about it.
And Mark, so let's take that a step deeper. Whether it's white privilege or male privilege, these are systems that are being used, as Oneika said, as either voluntary or involuntary weapons against other communities. How do we create more conversation and space for dialogue around privilege? Because it feels like, especially in the US, there is this need. If there's anything that I think this time in our country and our culture is defined by, is this need for more empathy. So.
Sure. And I think I'll take it just a little left and you can drag me back. But the advocate has a lot to answer for in today's day and age. The advocate for whatever that is, the militant advocate has extra to answer for. And having been one myself, it is one of the most exclusionary positions you can take up, which is regardless of your color or ethnic background, whatever that may be, you say, you don't know anything about this population, I do, I'm a subject matter expert, you are not welcome at my table because you are part of the problem. And it's dangerous and it's been holding us back from solutions for a very long time, which the real root, the pivot to that or the reframe that I would offer is, I'm hurting, I service a population that is terribly hurting, we want to heal, we don't want to pass blame, we want solution. Because we've been passing blame for a very, very, very long time and it's real. But at this point, we need a pivot to solution. So I don't think anything, again, in this forgiveness place absolves anybody of anything. It's just a place of, when I started working with homelessness and with people who are street entrenched and mentally ill in particular, advocates were like, who is this white, hip chef? He doesn't know anything about this. And I got lambasted. On social media, articles were written, PhDs wrote like white papers about why my business was a bad idea. And none of them had any idea about my history or who I am. They had no idea that I'd been unhoused, none of that. So sight unseen, they judged me in the exact same way they wanted their population not to be judged. And advocacy is dangerous. So I think that if we can just practice a little bit more of that deep empathy that we wish for the people that we serve, to the people that we wish would come to the table in a meaningful manner, we're in a better place. And it's hard to do. It's really hard to do when you just want to yell at people.
Because yelling at people feels good.
Does it ever?
Right?
Do you feel that right now?
It feels good. I got a little triggered by what you were saying.
What was triggering?
Yeah, because
Please.
it's real. We were talking earlier about, now I'm coming out in front of a whole bunch of people talking about this whole idea of forgiveness. I come from, like, my grandfather was a Black Panther and a union organizer. And to say the word forgiveness as a person of color, like, are you crazy? Like, what is wrong with you? And it was a journey to get to a place where I had to finally say, like, I got to unhook from that narrative. I got to unhook from the idea that the way that a certain group of people feels about me, and still feels about me, has to be a part of my existence. It was so much power, but I was so comfortable with the suffering and the hatred because it was so much a part of my identity. Like, I could identify as somebody who was angry because this country is racist. Like, that's a good lane, right? Because it could fuel me. It could fuel certain things. Angela Davis even talked about this in an article with her sister. One of her sisters is really into meditation and mindfulness, and they had like a little bit of a schism at one point because her sister wanted to talk about wellness practices for activists, and Angela at the time didn't want to hear it. But I think it becomes really important to soften into your own experience, and it gives you power that you didn't know that you had, you didn't know that you were missing. But to take that leap is to get past this idea of fear that if I let go of that hate that I have for you, then who am I? Mm-hmm. Who am I then? If I'm not the person who's angry, then what am I? And then that means I got to look at myself and what if I love again and get hurt? what if I love again and get my heart broken? Or the next time somebody calls me the N-word or whatever, then what does that mean? And I think when you were talking about this whole idea that advocacy is dangerous, I was like, I went back to that old story for a second. I did. I'm like, no, it's not, but yes, it is. No, it's not, yes, it is. Right? Like I'm
Multiple
having,
truths.
like you get all these feelings, but it is.
Yeah.
I will say that that's one thing that I have seen through our work with incarcerated people. And if there is something that you really love about the work of working with incarcerated people, frequently people come to us and they say, oh, you're so great for what you do. And I think you would agree, it is, we are 1,000 times to 1 more receiving than what we give. And one of the things that I love, and it touches on what you were both saying, is incarcerated people, they have a way of taking a disempowering story and to turn it into an empowering story. And that every one of us can learn from. You know, I would venture to say if we're here at a really wonderful conference in this wonderful establishment, everyone's doing okay. I'm sure everyone wants better accommodation in life, and we're all struggling through something, but on your worst day, if you could ever imagine having your worst day and then, you know, running into the police on that worst day and ending up in prison and having to work back from that narrative, to take that and to turn that into an empowering narrative is something that, if we're going to have this conversation about forgiveness, it really does start with self, you know. And one of the things I wanted to ask Carine for you to go in a little deeper, and I, in particular, there's so much happening in this country that a country like Rwanda could really provide vision and leadership. There are many difficult conversations around race and gender in America, where if a country that has gone through the horror, like Rwanda, can somehow crawl out of the, you know, the cauldron of hell, perhaps we can learn from. And one of the things that I loved about your father's work was his declaration that in a system of abusers and victims, you have to declare that the system is broken. There's a saying in the street that you all have probably heard, don't hate the player, hate the game, right? So in a situation like Rwanda, you're basically saying the game was wrong for everybody, and we declare the game is at fault. And then what you do is you just sort of take account to figure out what each person's role was in the game, right? So it takes that individual onus of forgiveness and it puts it into a communal sense. And are there lessons that you could help to share with us from things that you knew of and know of your dad's work?
Yeah, so I think Rwanda, although it is doing much better today and it's growing economically and it's growing, attracting more and more people from around the world, is still healing and it's still rebuilding and it's still reconstructing. But part of like what my father's work has been in regards to truth and reconciliation was how to bring people together to discuss it. And similar to the Gacaca court that I mentioned earlier, the most important step to beginning that reconstruction was the acceptance, the realization that everyone is affected and that you have to come together to be willing to converse about it and to find the solutions and find where things went wrong to be able to better dissect the problem. But yeah, so I think, and most importantly, and the biggest lesson of all is the conversation and being willing to have it.
So on that, Oneika, I'm going to ask you to help to lead. There's, at this very moment on this day, there is tremendous adversity in our country. Topics of gender and sexual assault and how poorly I think this country is handling many sensitive and delicate conversations, it just shows once again, a culture of blame, particularly of women, and this constant need for women to have to prove themselves and an allegation in these systems of male privilege and patriarchy. And I'm trying to bite my tongue.
You're doing great.
I need a drink. So how can we have more deliberate conversations? How can we create more partnership to get to the crux of these critical conversations that I say are failing? They're failing. They're failing people. So.
You know, I think it's a couple of things. I think it's what Mark was talking about, is having seats at the table for everyone to have conversations. And I think when we talk about this idea of forgiveness, it's being able to have tools to deal with your own stuff as it comes up, and recognizing when something is happening and being able to acknowledge that it's happening. Some of you may have been triggered, you know, by some of the things that we were talking about, or even just the idea of talking about race, you know, makes you shift in your seat a little bit. And knowing the minute that happens, that's a time to pause, right? And that's a time to stop and not to run past that and run past it through a feeling or whatever, but to recognize that that's happening. And they're like different, I think, and this sounds trite, but I think mindfulness practices are really important as we start to have these hard conversations. So people who have been hurt can take care of themselves as these conversations happen, because that's important to acknowledge. So folks who are of privileged classes, whatever that is, make sure that they are listening. And to make sure that folks are able to listen if they feel triggered is to have techniques to help yourself calm down so you can really listen. And there's a technique that's called RAIN. Tara Brach, who is a meditation teacher, made it really popular. And the R stands for recognition of when one of these feelings comes up. And the A is for allowing or accepting the feeling to happen as it's happening. And the I is to investigate why that feeling is coming up. And the N, lots of times, stands for non-attachment, but I also like to think of it as nurturing. And you're nurturing yourself in that moment when these feelings come up. And it's a great technique to use at any time. So it's not just if you're doing a meditation practice, but the minute that something, you know, that feeling, that tightness, Pema Chodron, the Tibetan Buddhist monk, calls it chempa. It's a word for a tightening. So the minute that somebody says something to you and you go, I don't like that, that's a moment to sort of practice that RAIN technique. I think it's an important tool as we dig into this.
Excellent. Mark, I want you to jam on that. But if there are questions, we're running short on time. Make your way to the mic. We want to make sure you get your questions on the mic. And if you don't have questions, I'm going to keep asking. So, but Mark, can you take us into that a little deeper?
Definitely. So when the Me Too movement was started, I was called upon as a chef and as a person that's visible to make a statement about it, because my industry is incredibly misogynistic. The kitchen is one of the worst places in the world, or has traditionally been, for women, for people who identify as anything other than straight white men. It's a challenging place. So we do a dinner series called the Greasy Spoon Diner. We do it once a month. We've done it for 44 straight months. That dinner brings people from all different walks of life to my diner in the hood and makes things very comfortable for conversation. Instead of calling out and directly attaching the two, I said, we're going to do an entire year with a partner of mine, Chef Charlotte Langley, of chefs that happen to be female, in brackets, because you don't say female CEO or female chef, although everybody does casually. We wanted to call attention to the misogyny that exists just in that alone. And with that, we started to have the chefs that we brought in talk about, what is it that's resonant for you amongst this movement? How can you draw a line to it without being extremely confrontational and isolating, but also creating discussion? So you get to course 3, you've had 3 drinks, you've been eating, and then we hit you. And you're not going to miss dessert. So you're stuck, and you have to have the conversation, but you're also in a place of trust. I've created a container by that point where the doors are locked, and you can't fucking go anywhere. No. Where we want you to stay and have this conversation that does exactly that. And then hopefully by the time you've left, you've decided that whether it's a car dealership or anything else that you're doing, that you're going to go back and look a little bit harder at what you do. Women who live in the street, who've been street entrenched, not 50%, not 70%, 100% are sexually assaulted and or raped in their time in the street. So we talk about that directly and say the people who are in our employ aren't a maybe, they're a definite. So we want to talk about this and ensure that everybody's safe at some junction.
Do I see any? Yes.
I just have a question, maybe Oneika or something. I think about like the cycle of healing, and how, as you talked about the trans woman who is, maybe going through and kind of coming to life. There's going to be a moment where something comes in life, out of left field, and just hit you with a baseball bat or whatever. And like, how do you deal with those cycles where you see somebody building them up, and then they drop again? You have to keep building them up. I'm sure you see that a lot. I don't know. When that popped into mind.
Yeah. Thank you for that.
Perpetual spirit.
It happens all the time. It happens to me all the time. I'm a survivor of sexual abuse. And this journey of healing is not a one and done thing, right? And we live in a world, and things will constantly happen to us. And particularly if you are of a group of a vulnerable population, things will arise. And it's being able to let those things arise, and softening around it, and really recognizing it. And that's when we start to open this door to being more compassionate to ourselves and being okay with that experience, and knowing that it's a complete part of ourselves. I think what happens when we tend to resist and push away feelings that make us uncomfortable, it makes it worse, right? What you push against pushes back even harder. So it's saying like, okay, this is happening. Can I breathe into this moment? Sometimes it feels good to investigate it. Sometimes it's not good to investigate it, and you shouldn't, right? I think what's really important when we're talking about compassionate practices, this just shouldn't be another form of suffering, right? There's already so much suffering that's happening. So it's being easy with yourself. We talk about forgiveness, and it doesn't have to be a hard thing. It should be a friendly thing, and approaching those moments with kindness. The same student, when we were talking about, she was like, I haven't really come out, and when it feels safe, like I want to, and she was talking about when she has bad feelings that come up, and we were laughing about it because she said it's not easy. I was like, no, if it were easy, everybody would do it. If it were easy, we wouldn't be having this conversation. So it's knowing that it's going to happen. And when it does happen, allowing yourself to be okay with that, taking a moment, if it feels safe, that's important, right? It has to feel safe. You can look at those feelings and breathe into them. Or you can acknowledge the fact that something uncomfortable is happening, and you recognize it in your body and know that it's not necessarily real, and you can come back to it at another time or explore it with, a professional or a counselor or somebody if that's something that needs to happen too. And knowing that it's going to, happen again, but the more practice that you do with these mindful practices, the ability to lessen can sometimes become easier and easier.
Especially with maybe people who don't have the privilege of having access to all those coping mechanisms,
Yes.
or just know that it will be all right because I have a community who will pick me back up
Right.
and support me.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's such an important point that, again, it comes back to this idea of how can I support myself in this moment, even if it feels really hard, and even if it doesn't feel okay, and being authentic and not faking it, right? You can't fake this stuff, right? Because it only creates, I think, more suffering eventually.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.
So it looks like we are out of time. I don't know if Robin, you'll be mad at me, but I'm not ready to leave yet. So, oh, we got one more over here. So,
would you mind? Something that was very powerful that I heard you say was that sometimes advocates or militant views can be the most exclusionary, the least forgiving. And then you mentioned Angela Davis and your grandfathers back then with the Panthers. I was at a conference recently in San Francisco around culture and politics that got extremely, extremely heated. And the left advocates were saying the type of things that it seems so ironic that they didn't understand that when Trump says, punch that guy in the face, they were saying the same thing about the other side. But in conversation with them privately, we are at such a polarized point in society that they honestly, truly feel that if they don't maintain this defense and this attack and this wall, they will be completely annihilated, meaning we will be completely annihilated, meaning people of color, transgender will be annihilated. That's what's at stake. How would you counsel those people? What do you tell them in terms of forgiveness when they feel that they are on the front lines protecting us from certain destruction, at least communities of marginalized communities?
I would like to start, and I'm going to kick it over. So years ago, I went through a bit of a, I don't know why they call it a midlife crisis. It was more like a midlife clarifying moment, we'll call it.
Whatever you need to say.
Yeah, they're like, yeah, whatever you need to do, midlife
Whatever helps
crisis.
you sleep at night.
We got you.
He was really screwed up. No, so I guess I quit my job and I ended up doing yoga 6 days a week for 3 hours a day, and it was like working on myself in silence for 3 hours a day. You do that for 2 years straight, you're going to get clear on a couple of things. And it was right around the time of Trayvon Martin, Mike Brown. It was a really dark moment for this country 3 or 4 years ago where we were in a confrontational stance, communities of color with police, government, vice versa. And I was watching, as we all were, CNN, and I was looking at the protests, and I was looking at my people. I was looking at people of color, and I was in pain because all I could see was the look of pain and suffering on the faces of the people. I didn't feel like we were advancing the cause. I felt like we were being tricked into losing our sense of agency and losing, just losing, and digging ourselves further in a hole. And it was honestly at that point that I found Oneika and others to begin to take yoga and meditation practices to traumatize people. And I think part 2 of this discussion that we probably won't be able to have today, but we can continue to beer and wine, there is an inextricable link between activist communities, forgiveness, and trauma. And trauma is the root of the tree that we don't have the tools to discuss, because these are communities, activist communities are trying to evidence the stories of trauma and communities that have been traumatized through America's history, and in the process are being re-traumatized. Do you understand? So it's like double jeopardy. So I think even in your question, I ask you to have empathy for those activists. Because the woman who was on the stage just before we took, she talked about what it means to have the fatigue of the activist, right? Always being that person of color in those rooms who has to take up this, the emotional burden of having to correct everybody, right? So I don't even know the points of the conversation, and yet I know that it was a sense of loss of agency, right? So I just wanted to maybe give that framing. But Robin, you gonna kick us out, or 5 minutes? Okay.
It's a really big question, right? It's a big question. It's the question that I struggled with so much, having to give up that identity of being angry. It was in January, for the second year in a row, I do a civil rights tour with my family down in Mississippi and Alabama. And we ride with some freedom riders which is just an amazing experience. And one of the tour guides was he did the nonviolence training that MLK did, and there is something that is powerful in the idea of embracing nonviolence, but it is very hard to see when you are actively being hit, right? It's hard to say like, yeah, I'm good with this, because you're not. Who is good with that? I think it's beginning to offer practices of compassion for activists. I actually did a panel a couple of years ago at a justice conference on compassionate practices for activists, because compassion fatigue is real. It's a thing. And it is hard to see the forest through the trees if you aren't taking care of yourself. So I think it is important for activists who are, have a mission to be able to take care of themselves. And I think, that's part of this work that I do. It's part of like coming out as a forgiveness person. And it is a coming out because, there are a lot of friends who do not agree with the way that I think about this. And being able to say like, it's okay, right? It doesn't let anybody, as Mark said, off the hook, but I love myself enough to do this, because I can't keep doing this work if I don't take care of myself. So there's no easy answer, but I think it is starting to have more of these kinds of conversations around what it means to take care of yourself if you're going to continue to help other people. I know it's not a straight answer, but
I think it is.
I want you to.
I want to build on it if that's okay.
Yeah.
So we created this diner and this place very specifically as a building of inclusion. And to give it some frame, a block this way, there's 1.6 or 1.8 million dollar condos. 5 doors down, where my restaurant and diner and place sits, adjacent to it is $280 SRO, or single room occupancy. So gentrification is like on the doorstep. Mm-hmm. And it's very heated at all times. And so when we opened, I said, this place is Switzerland. Cops, cons, gentrifiers, advocates, everybody's going to come here and discuss and know that there's ground rules to this, that there is mistakes that are going to be made in conversation, and when we have gatherings, and those mistakes are going to be called as such, and that they won't inflame, because this place has been here for the community since 1957. And what I wanted to do was channel that energy back into how can you be of value to this thing that is important to you. So how can you bring value to a solution or value to your community or to your family in a way that is not tokenism? And because people come to me all the time and say, I want to cook. And I'd say, do you know how to cook? And be like, no. I'm like, well, I don't give out free cooking lessons, jackass. Like, what do you do? Like, well, I'm a UX designer. I couldn't possibly be of value. Like, have you seen many social impact websites? I think that you could be of tremendous value in helping people understand that when they find their purpose, they walk into that space and they bring their value, that is their skills, their training, and inherently what they do, that we can heal.
absolutely.
But if they don't, or there's not a bridge made or allowed to let them explore that, but also to impact it, then we just have all of this tension, which is, I see the problem, there's nothing I can do about it. Like, oh no, there's something you can always do about it, but those lines haven't been really clear. So to create access for people to be active healing, be part of the active healing, I think is incredibly important, while also recognizing that there's penance.
Well, on that note, I want to say this conversation impacts me deeply. I have a 23-year-old son who we haven't been seeing eye to eye. And you have inspired me. This group on this stage has inspired me. So when I leave here today, I'm going to call him and ask him to forgive me of my parent privilege. And I'm going to ask him for forgiveness, which is a big deal for me, trust me. So I invite each of you to think in your lives, there's not one of us who hasn't inadvertently stepped on a toe or elbowed someone in your own way. Maybe it's by writing a letter, sending an email or a text, picking up the phone, or having coffee. I hope that each one of us will find a way to inspire somebody by showing them you see them, You may have rubbed them the wrong way, and you want to offer them wholeness. So on that note, I just want to thank you for this conversation today. I want to thank my sisters and brothers, my friends on the forefront of forgiveness for this conversation. And Robin, thanks for having us. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Bring it in.
I literally have tears in my eyes. Wow. Thank you.
Thank you, Robin.
Thank you. Yeah. I literally have tears in my eyes, and I definitely have somebody that I'm going to be calling at the end of the day today. So I'm going to end with that. I'm going to end with wow. If you're interested, we're going to do a happy hour, 5 to 8 at Studio Square Garden. I'll buy you all drinks if you're willing to continue the conversation, or food of choice, whatever. And yeah, for us and for you, if you come back tomorrow, I hope and welcome. Would love to continue the conversation on and off stage. We can make things happen. But it's been a long day. It's a lot. And there's a lot more to come. So spend time with your friends, spend time with your loved ones. Get a full night of sleep tonight. Don't get too over it at happy hour. But serious, whatever that is for you, right? So I'm going to go to the gym tonight and tomorrow. And I'm going to do some handstands because that's how I take care of myself. So what are you going to do for yourself? Tomorrow back here at 9 a.m. I look forward to continuing then. Thank you very much.